Thank you, everyone. With that, we come to an end of a very, very interesting panel discussion on fraud frontiers, the rising digital footprints, and fraud possibilities. Thanking each one of our panelists for sharing with us those valuable insights and your thoughts on the topic. Now, we move on to our next part, which is a keynote address by Shri Parthasarathy, National Managing Partner, Trust and Transformation at Grant Thornton. I'll invite Mr. Parthasarathy on stage to now address our audiences. Welcome and good morning, Mr. Parthasarathy. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Good day to every one of you, considering that this stage essentially is being multicasted across the world. Good day to all of you, irrespective of where you're watching this particular event. And it's a pleasure to be here speaking to all of you today and talking at this important summit in terms of security, trust, and other areas that we'll be talking about. With that, let me just quickly share my presentation, which won't take more than a second. Are you able to see it?
Yes, it's right there now. You can continue.
Wait. And should I put it on full screen? Okay, let me do that. Let me see how that come out. Just a second. Okay, great. I'm going to go for just 1 second. Okay. In a way of introduction, my name is Sri Parthasarathy. I manage trust and transformation, and the theme of what I will speak today, I think, is elevating it beyond security and moving to an area of trust. And I think all organizations, and irrespective of what COVID has done in many negative ways, I think when we look at it in the areas of digital, and when we look at it in terms of adoption of technology, there has been a rapid acceleration and adoption of technology across. And organizations which may have completely thought that they are going to be brick and mortar today essentially are adopting technologies and virtual technologies, remote working, and that essentially has become the norm of how people work worldwide. And so today a person could be working from Tibet, Timbuktu, or any other location, and he could still be servicing his particular client. Of course, there are issues like taxation and other things, which I believe the authorities will figure out over a period of time. But let's come back to the environment itself. The environment is rapidly changing. It is a revolution. And however, transformation happens if you sustain this particular transformation journey and sustain this particular culture. And it is going to be important, how do you embrace the technologies, how do you manage change within the environment, because there is going to be that apprehension in terms of adopting these particular technologies and how they basically look at. Transformation cannot be singular. What we mean by that is essentially irrespective of whether you look at it from your supply chain, whether you look at it within your organization, whether you look at it as your employees, your third parties, your fourth parties, your customers, is a question of how do you bring a lot of this particular change, whether it's operational transformation, whether it's digital technology, how do you bring them all together? And how does technology as the underlying layer bring it all together in a unified fashion, and how does it make it cohesive? How can data that is being collected across all of these be used for the advantage of the corporation and for enhancing quality of service to your end customer? With that, I think when you think about it, it's all about trust and transformation when organizations are looking at it. And why are we elevating it to the level of trust? I think technology has become a given today. It's no longer what you call as an enabler. It's no longer as something that is going to be somewhere in the back office. Everybody understands that technology is a given. Technology is a differentiator. And without technology, I think organizations in the future cannot possibly survive. Given that, I think there are multiple aspects that one really needs to look at. One needs to look at security, one needs to look at resilience, one needs to look at quality of service, one needs to look at privacy. So when you really look at it, and I think going back to the old definition of security where you talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now we are adding a few other parameters related to quality of service and other thing, and expanding that, and then saying that this is what is essentially trust. Why is it so important? In you, all of you are security or technology professionals here. In you is where the organization is putting the trust that the platform on which they are sort of creating their particular organization essentially will be resilient, available, and non-compromisable at any point in time. And when you are the base foundation, and when there's so much of trust being put on you that this particular platform is what is going to support the entire enterprise, I think there's a lot of responsibility and accountability on each one of your shoulders. Whether you're doing in risk and compliance, whether you're doing security engineering, whether you're doing security operations, whether you're doing any of those particular areas where you are protecting the enterprise, I think there's a lot of accountability and responsibility. It is very similar to a soldier on the border of our particular country who essentially is holding a gun and who's essentially watching on a regular 24 by 7 basis, and he's saying essentially, how do I protect the country? Similarly, I think each one of you are interested with protecting the enterprise, which continues to basically transform and which continues to move in its journey. And all of this particular transformation, which are basically aspects that you cannot control, or areas where essentially technology will be introduced, new types of customers will come in, how the customers will access the data will be different. All of these things will continue to be thrown at you, and you will have to continue to essentially create a sound platform, and essentially a trusted platform or a secure platform which everybody will be very comfortable about building their enterprise on. Trust cannot be measured. It manifests through actions, and which is where what we really look at is essentially you cannot really look at return on investment. You can possibly look at effectiveness of investment. So it's a simple factor today. If you're providing your service on the net, and if the net is not available, a customer is going to come to you once, is going to come to you twice. If it is not available beyond that, he's going to move away. So, for example, if you were ordering food and if the platform was not available, or if the platform was messing up in terms of delivering the wrong kind of food or to a wrong address and or the wrong time, then essentially there's a aspect of quality of service. Or when you were going into the app, all of us understand that most of these particular services are accessed through apps. If the app is not available, or essentially the last mile provider is not possibly providing those particular services. Many of you may have experienced this with some of your car providers recently, where essentially, well, while you tend to book your particular service, at the last minute they basically cancel the service. That kind of a quality of service or the connectivity that you possibly build essentially erodes the trust and trust with the end customer. So it's a question of how do you really manage that particular thing, and how do you manage your entire value chain, which is going to be very important. How do I move this screen? Just 1 second. Great. Where we are, why is it skip 2 slides? Just 1 second. Okay, fine. Yeah, where we are today, I think everybody understands. When you look at it, we are in the dawn of the transformative age. We've already entered the digital era. There's an explosion of technologies that are coming at us. Let me start with the bottom layer. When you really look at it, cloud first strategy has been adopted by many organizations, and I think for an organization to be competitive, they need to essentially have the cloud first strategy. Exponentials are continuing to rise. The economies of how they can actually be sort of served back to the larger community or the larger customer base is essentially being worked out. There are significant number of technologies, whether you talk of blockchain, whether you talk of cryptocurrency, whether you talk of 3D printing, which may not be completely in real life today. And what I mean by that in terms of adoption, they are not completely adopted, but essentially are rapidly accelerating towards that. The question of how do you put the right kind of checks and balances around that, and how do you really manage that? Rise of digital only business models. I think we have seen in the last 20 years organizations becoming going into trillions just being a digital only business. Organizations which essentially do not own any assets, but essentially what they do, they own data, they basically own the supply chain or the value chain, and that is how organizations are moving. Endpoints have increasingly become desperate. What we mean by that is essentially your organizational boundary or the enterprise, the perimeter of the enterprise has further grayed with what has happened post COVID. Today, people used previously people used to work in some of those particular fantastic buildings or those towers where essentially everything was secure, where you say that, hey, I'm not going to be taking any data out in or out and those kind of things. Now essentially people could be working from a cafe, they could be working from anywhere across the world. It's a question of how do you manage each one of these endpoints, and these endpoints are not always going to come just through your network. They're going to go to the cloud, and they're going to get secure and then come into your particular data center. So how do you manage those particular endpoints from a perspective of identities, from a perspective of non-repudiation, from a perspective of fraud, from a perspective of securing those particular endpoints from a resilience perspective? Let's say an employee is primarily working for you from an location which is remote. Now all of a sudden you have to manage that particular remote location not only from a technology and resilience perspective, but also from a security perspective. So how are you putting the right checks and balance into that? Security and privacy and availability in focus. As I said, security, privacy, resilience, quality of service are all significantly important. Why are we rapidly moving towards this? Even before the COVID, even before COVID, there was the rise of machines, and there was a significant amount of automation, there was a significant amount of RPA and other things that were being done within the enterprise. But over a period of time, when you really look at it, the rise of machines, I think, has started being accepted, and it's not going to be in very distant future where your employee or your fellow colleague may actually be a machine. So from an overall perspective, that is something that is being adapted. And essentially, if you look at it, the talent shortage is significant across the enterprise. When you start thinking about the talent shortage is becoming acute across the world. And then when you start thinking about digital disruptors, uh, there's a confluence of technology, there is a confluence of things that are sort of coming together, which essentially is making it that much more available in terms of digital and technology, which essentially can provide the services wherever you're sitting. True omnipresence, cloud adoption was accelerating, COVID again accelerated. And now, when you really look at it, I think that's when I said there is a silver lining in everything that happens, and which is where I think we have truly entered the digital era, the truly the virtualization age or the transformation age, where organizations are completely consuming a lot of this particular technologies and are adopting it, and they realize that their only way of truly servicing this is essentially going digital. So what does that mean to all of you? If the enterprise is rapidly accelerating towards that, and these are some of the factors that you need to consider, what is it that really, what is important for each one of you to basically look at? Each one of you have to look at sustainable transformation. If you transform, and this essentially for a lot of you who have been in technology, let's take an example of release management. Let's say you release a dot release of a particular software, and the dot release essentially fails. and all of us have seen this across major platforms. They release a major release, which they possibly release sometime in September or October, and then essentially 1 month later they have to release several other security releases and all things. That's not sustainable transformation. So when you do a release management or when you do something, it's a question of how do you essentially ensure that whatever you've done has the right level of quality. Trust in data and identity protection through cyber and information security. I think identity, considering the number of endpoints, considering the value chain expanding, considering that you're not going to have complete visibility about everybody who's coming in through your enterprise in terms of 100% way. How do you really manage that identity from a perspective of non-repudiation, in terms of identification, authorization, and access governance? How do you really manage that particular aspect? The second element that you need to think about, which is going to be very, very important, is the aspect of, previously it used to be called business continuity. Now it has other terms of business continuity, disaster recovery, resilience, crisis. All of these essentially are terminologies, but ultimately they go back to the fundamental aspect of being a going business. A business has to be a going concern, which means that it has to be up and running. And in you is where your particular leadership is entrusting the very aspect which is the fundamental nature to business of being a going concern. That means you have to ensure that the business is resilient. And what does that mean? Resilience doesn't just mean that the infrastructure is up, infrastructure is running, it has the right bandwidth, it has everything that is going. It is not just about that. It is also ensuring that essentially that infrastructure cannot be compromised, brought down, and in case of a disaster, in case of an incident, then how do you very quickly come back up? It's a question of, that is what resilience. It's not about a matter of if, it's just a matter of when organizations will be hit based on incident or what really happened. It's a question of how fast can they actually recover from that and continue to go. There is a classic case of an organization which was in the World Trade Center, and incidentally, I'm a 9/11 survivor, and this particular organization was in only one tower of World Trade Center, and the entire organization got wiped out. All of its assets, everything that it basically did, it was almost like a 30-year-old organization which got wiped out in 30 seconds. And that is what can potentially happen if you do not look at BCP or resilience of your particular infrastructure, which essentially is managing your overall enterprise. Trust in your extended enterprise. I think it is clear to all of us that it is not us alone who possibly do all of this work. It is a value chain that we create. It's a value chain of our suppliers. It's a value chain of how we work with third parties and fourth parties. And we bundle all of these particular services and provide the value added services back to our customers. So the question of how do you actually manage this particular third party, fourth party, not just from a perspective of strategic sourcing, but also in terms of making sure that if you have certain policies, if you have certain governance, if you have certain standards that you are maintaining, that your third parties and your supply chain will also maintain the same thing, whether it's in terms of security, whether it's in terms of privacy, resilience, quality of service, because ultimately what you provide essentially is bundling of some of these plus what you add on top of that and which you'll provide. And if something fails, if your weakest link fails, which may be one of your third party, then your overall value chain gets disrupted. And which I think all of us saw during pandemic. I think there's been a severe shortage in terms of several things, but I think the government really stepped up fantastically because none of us really went hungry. And I think from that aspect, the government fantastically managed some of the value chain, but there were shortages in medicine. There were shortages in other supplies, and those essentially got affected over a period of time. Similarly, more recently, I think if any of you have bought cars, you would notice that there's a very long wait because there's a breakdown in the electronic supply chain. And Now the manufacturer has his entire car, but he cannot possibly sell that car because the supply chain is broken. So how do you manage supply chain resilience? And that essentially is a very, very important aspect. Trust in your talent workforce. Talent workforce essentially has changed. Previously, I think the old adage was everybody would be an employee. Then we went on to be employees and contractors. Then we went into employees, contractors, and outsource providers. Now, essentially, we are looking at employees, we are looking at gig workers, we are looking at freelance workers, we are looking at a conglomeration of different people who will come in at different points on time to provide those particular services. So, how do you do the right level of workforce transformation, and how do you manage workforce? And yesterday I was talking to internal auditor of a very large organization, and he was saying, "Hey, we would like to do workforce transformation, but essentially, how do we manage? How do we know who is the person working? How do we manage the trust element between this particular workforce? How do we train these particular people? How do we keep them connected with the brand? Are they going to be connected with a paycheck, or are they connected with the brand? And how do we enforce our particular culture, our particular policies, and all of that on them? And at the same time, have a secure infrastructure, just like how if they were to come and work within my large center, so that I can provide the same assurance back to my customer." So essentially, regulators, customers, and others dictate certain requirements which get translated into your particular environment, and you essentially use your employees, your gig workers, and your supply chain to basically provide those services. So essentially, when you take those third and fourth bucket, you have to manage that very critically, because that essentially is where the breakdown can most likely happen. Trust and sustainability through governance, compliance, and risk management. I think this is extremely important. You would need to have that particular rear view mirror. Today, if most of when most of you buy a car, you're not going to go and check if there is a brake. You're not going to check if there is steering wheel. Of course, in future, it may get replaced with a joystick, and you have to adapt to that. But however, you take certain things for granted. You take a seatbelt for to be granted. You take certain things related to essentially the airbags to be granted. You take certain things like brakes to be granted, right? And all of these are certain things that need to be built. So similar to how you are building resilience, security, and all things, you also need to build governance, risk, and compliance within your particular enterprise. And why are all of these important? As your organization continues to transform, as your organization continues to gallop towards competing, your front end people who are essentially providing those particular services want to go and basically commit in terms of just in time, go to market, and all of that. And your technology that you have needs to continue to basically transform and gallop, not at that speed, but even faster, because essentially technology, if technology is going to be the driver, technology all and digital and others essentially have to gallop at that fast. And that means essentially security, privacy, quality of service, crisis resilience, risk management, all of those also have to gallop much faster. You have to be ahead of the curve rather than essentially looking at what the requirements are coming and trying to fix it. I think that is one of the things what I would look at is in terms of proactive trust building, proactive trust in your particular enterprise and essentially your stakeholders, which essentially is going to be significantly important. With that, let me basically pause and see if there are any questions from anybody. And once again, thank you for providing me this particular platform. I think we talked about trust, we talked about transformation, which is how I think we should look at it, because we are now elevating the pitch from just security, privacy, and resilience. I think all of these things have to come together and provide the right level of trust, so that your customers, your customers of your organization are essentially looking at you as a trusted enterprise where they can basically put their confidence and continue to basically grow. With that, back for any questions.